The folder was 412 pages thick, and every one of them was wrong. I didn't know that when the morning courier dropped it on my intake desk. I knew it by the time I got to page 9. By page 30, I'd stopped marking the usual errors: transposed catalog codes, duplicate tissue sample references, the standard sloppiness you find in field team submissions, and started reading the way you read something that's making you uneasy, without being able to say why. My name is Dace Morin. In the year this happened, I was a grade 4 classification clerk at the Galactic Survey Bureau's secondary processing station, Arvel's Reach, which orbited a brown dwarf at the edge of the Rethian Passage and handled about 11,000 biological intake files per standard cycle. Not glamorous work. The light through the long observation windows was always the same flat amber, because a brown dwarf doesn't give you much else. I had been there for 6 years. I was good at it. The subject of the folder had been logged under Bureau Tracking Number VR7-Indigo 9, designated Unclassified Biological Mass, Category 7, which was the Bureau's polite language for something large, ambulatory, and inconveniently difficult to slot into the existing taxonomy trees. The field team that had encountered it listed its dimensions in 3 separate appendices, each time with slightly different numbers, as if they kept hoping the creature would turn out smaller on a second look. It hadn't. The photographs were taken from what I estimated was a significant distance, and even so the subject filled the frame. What I noticed, reading those 9 pages, was that the field team had filed no behavioral observation notes whatsoever. That was the thing that was wrong. Category 7 filings required behavioral observations. It was Form BIO7F, 4 pages, mandatory. The folder had a placeholder sheet where BIO7F should have been, stamped, pending, subject non-cooperative, which told me the field team had tried to run the behavioral protocol. The subject had not complied, in whatever way they expected compliance to look like, and the team had decided to log it as a data gap, rather than describe what had actually happened. I put a query flag on page 9 and kept reading. By page 30, I understood the shape of it. The field team had spent 11 days with the subject and had never once spoken to it. They had measured it, photographed it from a distance, taken a tissue sample under sedation, run spectral analysis on its ambient vocalization patterns, and logged all of it in the clean procedural language that makes living things look like mineral deposits. The subject had a vocalization range. The subject had a mass index. The subject had a thermal signature. The subject was accorded no more interiority than a mid-tier fauna specimen, because the field team had decided, somewhere around day 2, that its size and its solitude meant there was nothing to talk to. I set the folder down and looked out through the annex window into the processing bay. The subject was standing at the clearance window across from my desk. I had not been told it was here in person. The intake form said remote processing, file only, no physical presentation, but there it was, enormous and quiet in the middle of a room built for beings a third its size, standing with its long arms loose at its sides, not moving, not making a sound, watching the clerks at their desks, with a patience that was not the patience of an animal waiting to be let out. It was watching the way a person watches when they have learned that the best strategy is to be still and let the humans finish whatever they're doing before expecting to be noticed. I picked up the folder and walked to the clearance window. The clerks on either side of me did not look up. Probably they'd already tried the standard greeting, gotten no response that fit into their processing scripts, and moved on to other files. That was how it usually went with Category 7 designations. The form had a checkbox for subject unresponsive to standard intake protocol, and it was almost always ticked, because the standard intake protocol was a recorded audio greeting in 17 common languages, none of which might be the language of anything genuinely new. I looked up at it through the window. It looked back down at me. "Can you understand what I'm saying?" I asked. I didn't say it loudly. I just said it the way you'd say it to anyone standing at a clearance window. Matter of fact. Like the answer was probably yes, and I was just making sure. Its eyes were large and very dark, with a quality of attention I recognized from the faces of beings who had been waiting a long time to be asked something sensible. It took 2 slow breaths. Then it said, in a low and careful voice that sounded like it was arranging unfamiliar sounds into known shapes, one word at a time, "Yes, since the 2nd day." The second day of 11. I stood there for a moment. I thought about the BIO7F placeholder. I thought about 11 days of measurements and photographs taken from a respectful distance, and not one field researcher thinking to ask. I'm going to need to redo parts of this file, I said. It didn't answer that, but it inclined its head, a small movement, very deliberate, the kind of thing that means I understand in almost any language. And something about the precision of it, the restraint of it, made the back of my neck go cold in the way it goes cold when you realize a mistake is much larger than you thought. I went back to my desk. I pulled the folder. I turned to the blank placeholder where BIO7F should have been, and did something I had never done in 6 years of grade 4 work. I filled it in by hand, in pen, from a single 2-minute conversation, writing down what it had said, and what its silence before that had looked like, and what the quality of its attention at that window meant to anyone paying attention. 3 behavioral observation pages in 15 minutes. Then I went to the front of the folder, to the official designation line, Unclassified Biological Mass, Category 7, and I did not change the bureau text, because I didn't have the authority to change the bureau text. But I had a small supply of paper processing tags, the kind you use to flag documents for secondary review, and I wrote on one of them with my pen, pressed it to adhesive, and fixed it to the inside front cover where any reviewer picking up the file would see it first. 3 words, Sapient, not Catalogued. That was all. I closed the folder, logged it for secondary review, and returned it to the courier tray. The Bureau's secondary review office sent it back 6 weeks later with a correction notice. The handwritten tag was flagged as a procedural irregularity. Physical attachments not conforming to standard form dimensions were not permitted in active files. The behavioral observations I had written were logged as informal clerk notes, non-standard, insufficient for reclassification. The designation remained Unclassified Biological Mass, Category 7. The case was closed. I kept a copy of the behavioral pages in my own records because I was a thorough person, and I moved on to the next 11,000 files. I left Arvell's Reach 2 years later. Eventually I stopped working for the Bureau entirely, and did consulting work for independent survey firms, with fewer forms, and slightly more interest in what was actually out there. I did not think often about VR7 Indigo 9. The Bureau had spoken, and the Bureau had a great many files to manage, and one clerk's handwritten tag was not going to move it. 11 years after that morning, I received a message from a surveyor named Catalogued, who worked for one of the independent firms I had consulted with. She had been doing archival research on misfiled Category 7 designations, building a case for reclassification reform, the kind of institutional fight that takes decades and usually fails, and she had found my old folder in the Arvell's Reach physical archive. The tag was still there. The adhesive had held. She wanted to know if I remembered the subject. I wrote back that I did. I asked her what had happened to it. She told me the Bureau had eventually reclassified it, not because of my notes and not because of her research, but because a separate contact team, 14 years after the original field survey, had formally established two-way communication with a community of the same species, who turned out to have named themselves, had oral histories going back several thousand years, and had strong opinions about being photographed from a distance without being spoken to first. The reclassification was now complete. The species had a formal designation in the Bureau's taxonomy of recognized persons. Catalogued ended her message with a question she said she asked everyone she tracked down from those old files. Had I expected anything to come of what I'd written? I thought about it before I answered. No, I wrote back. I hadn't expected anything. I had looked up from a folder at something looking back at me, and I had asked the obvious question that nobody had thought to ask, and it had answered. After that, writing the tag wasn't a decision. It was just the next true thing. The tag is still in the archive. I know because Catalogued sent me a photograph of it. 3 words, in my handwriting, on a small square of adhesive paper. It has survived 16 years of bureaucratic correction, 2 station reorganizations, and at least 1 formal attempt to purge non-standard physical attachments from the active filing system. Some things, it turns out, are harder to close out than they look.